everybody.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good to see you all today.
Got to turn it on?
You got to turn it on, it works better that way.
Well, sometimes.
How's that?
See how long it's gonna last. Oh, you're gonna last a long time.
Oh, good.
You can talk away.
I'm glad to hear I'm going to last a long time. Let's open in prayer. Lord, I thank you for this time to join together and to look at the book of Daniel again and dealing with pride and sinful pride and things, and to see that this over and over again, and help us to see that too in our lives. In Jesus' name, amen. Remember that this is called, Daniel is one of the exilic books. Exilic is a fancy word meaning of the exile. Remember, let's review a little bit. Why did God threaten to send Israel into exile? Remember?
They disobeyed.
For their disobedience, for not following the law and doing what he said. And did he threaten once, and when they disobeyed the first time, throw them into exile? No, what did he do? He gave them many chances. He sent prophets to them over and over again to remind them of the fact that if you don't straighten up and do what you're supposed to be doing, if you stop, you need to stop this idol worship you're doing and all the other things that we're doing, or I'm going to send you into exile. And the exile would be that for 70 years you will be held captive in another land, and then I will bring a remnant. What's a remnant? A small piece. I will bring a remnant back to the land to start again. But your punishment is going to be, you will be defeated by foreigners, and you will go into exile. And in the defeat by foreigners, many of you will be killed because of your rebellion against me. That was God's warning, and that's what the message of many of the prophets was about. And then Israel and the king he had given them, and they divided into two divisions, the northern division and the southern division. The northern had how many of the 12 tribes?
10.
This is a quiz. You guys do better here. 10, very good. I'll let you do it together, but you got to do better here. 10 tribes in the north, and Jeroboam took them there, and in order to keep all the tribes there and not go down to Jerusalem for worship, what did he do in Samaria? I gave you a big hint there. He set up a worship area there and didn't build the temple, but he provided the golden calves to worship, the idols. These are the gods that brought you out of Egypt. The southern kingdom was run by whom? Jeroboam was in the north and Rehoboam was in the south. And these were two sons of Solomon. Rehoboam, and there were how many tribes? Well, I told you, you had 10 at the top, there were 2 in the bottom. What were the 2 tribes that comprised the southern kingdom? Judah and Benjamin. Very good. You're starting to catch on now. Getting better. And in the northern, none of the kings of the northern kingdom were ever any good. They all were idol worshipers. They all were bad. All evil. Did terrible things. I mean, you read stuff in the scriptures, it's just terrible, terrible, terrible. In the south, you had a few good kings, but many of them were bad too. So after many, many hundreds of years, God then finally brought the Assyrians to the northern kingdom. Assyria was another country, did not worship the Lord, and they came and they captured the northern kingdom of Samaria. And what did they do in Samaria that ended up to be a problem later in Jesus' day? Remember? They interbred. They did not take all the Jews with them to Assyria, but they left the poorest of the Jews, the ones that to take care of the land, and they interbred with the Assyrians, which Israel wasn't supposed to do. And so that became a problem to the Jews in the south, who always held it over them, but the Jews in the south had interbred too, so they had no reason to be snotty and have their nose in the air. And then what kingdom took the southern two tribes? You gotta get this right. This is Daniel. I just said it. Babylon. The Babylonian kingdom took the southern two tribes, Nebuchadnezzar, and he took them into captivity. And when they brought them into captivity, that's why in Daniel 1, you read about the fact that the king was interested in what people that he brought with him. The educated, the young men that were handsome, showed that ability to learn easily, to do well, and were trained, could learn the Babylonian language, and could serve in his court. And that's where Daniel and his three friends fit in. So that's the context of what happens. So the whole time they're in captivity, God is going to be punishing or having, showing the kings that held them captive problems. Because even though they're doing what he wanted them to do, he's still going to punish them for doing it. Okay? God wanted him to do, betraying Jesus, but he got punished for doing it. So this is where we're at. So let's go back now to Daniel chapter 5. In Daniel chapter 5, this is the chapter where we read about the handwriting on the wall. Many, many tekel parson. I'm going to read verse 1 as I'm going to interrupt our normal pattern of Sam starting us out. I'm going to read verse 1, and she's going to take up from verse 2 and following. But I'm going to, because there's some things I want to deal with verse 1. So King Belshazzar, now this is not Belteshazzar. Whose name is Belteshazzar? Daniel's. King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. All right, I brought a commentary in today to read some of this because I do poorly with all these names and stuff, but to explain something to you. King Belshazzar, who is Belshazzar? Well, at this time, Nebuchadnezzar has died. This is years later. Nebuchadnezzar has died. And the Bible says that the king that was there last, before Cyrus took over, was King Belshazzar. And that's who Daniel is going to deal with in this situation. But the problem has been that until this last century, there was no record historically of a Belshazzar as king of Babylon. And so the critics of the Bible pointed to this again to say, see, you can't trust the Bible with its historicity. It's usually wrong. It has problems. It doesn't. Well, they said that until archaeological digs found the name Belshazzar. And they found some other names which the annals of the Babylonians hadn't recorded, and the whole story became more complete. So let me read you a little bit about this, if you don't mind. I hope I don't bore you to death, but just to give you some information. So the main character of Daniel 5 is Belshazzar, a king whom we have not yet met and whose presence in the narrative raises interesting and difficult historical questions. The transition from Daniel 4 to 5 is an abrupt one, and Belshazzar is thrust on the stage with no indication of the passage of time or the death of Nebuchadnezzar. This information is unnecessary for the purpose of the narrative, but it does raise questions in our mind, particularly since the rather full extra-biblical, that means outside the Bible, extra-biblical accounts of the lineage of Neo-Babylonian kings make no mention of a king called Belshazzar. So after the death of Nebuchadnezzar in 562 BC, he was succeeded by his son Amel Marduk. This is the evil Merodach of 2 Kings 25. That's recorded in there. This was his son that succeeded him. But he was there for only a short period of time, just 2 years, from 562 to 560. Remember, when you count before Christ, the years are counting down to 0, not counting up from 0, okay? So he was executed probably at the behest of the successor. Now, I'm not sure I get this guy's name right. I'm even going to try. Begin with an N, ends with an R, who ruled only a few years himself, just 4 years. This guy was succeeded by his son, Labash Marduk, who reigned for only 2 months before he was executed by the party that brought Nabonidus to the throne. Make any sense yet? No, it doesn't. It just telling you all this. There were several kings from Nebuchadnezzar until we get to till Belshazzar. And the reason is that they all were killing each other because they all wanted the reign and they were getting wiped out. Well, Nabonidus is recorded as the last king of the Babylonians in their accounts, since he ruled until the time of Cyrus entered Babylon and brought his kingdom to an end in 539 BC. So their records say that Nabonidus was the last king, not Belshazzar. So what about Belshazzar? Until recently, Belshazzar was thought to be one of those errors in the Bible's understanding of history that led many to doubt its accuracy. However, after the discovery and decipherment of cuneiform tablets, they were the first tablets that showed writing on them. I remember from your high school days, history, these strange dents and figures and stuff that were in the clay, the cuneiform. Well, they were able to decipher those eventually. And they found him. However, the discovery and this of the Cuneiform tablets began in the 19th century. We began to learn more and more about the period in question. As a result, Belshazzar emerged from the shadows as a definite historical character. Today, we have abundant textual witness to the fact that he was the son of Nabonidus. Now, according to the records, Nabonidus was the last king, the son, one of the sons of Nebuchadnezzar. More than that, Belshazzar was co-regent and actually in charge of Babylon during his father's 10-year absence from the capital city, thus explaining the reference to him as king. He never officially became king, but he reigned in his father's stead. His father left the city for 10 years and then died. Well, why did his father leave this city? Why was he not in Babylon? Well, here's the answer. The story of Nabonidus' absence from Babylon is an intriguing one, but we'll only give you a mere outline of the story. Thankful for that. In short, Nabonidus was a devotee of the moon god Sin, capital S-I-N, the chief god of his ancestral homeland, Haran. That's where who came out of? Abraham came out of Haran, right. While not a monotheist, he was interested in promoting the interest of this god Sin, which apparently angered the powerful Marduk priesthood. Evidence exists that his son, Belshazzar, did not share his devotion to the god Sin, and may even have led a party that, while not forcing Nabonidus to abdicate, that means to give up his reign, did result in his abandonment of the capital to take up residence in a site called Tema, located on the oasis, which is today modern Saudi Arabia. So all that was to tell you that Belshazzar's father, Nabonidus, was the last king, but for the last 10 years, he didn't reign in Babylon because of his interest in the sun god, and he got kicked out by everybody in Babylonia. They kicked him out, and he went to Saudi Arabia, and that's where he stayed until he died. But his son reigned in his stead, though his son was never officially made the king. Make sense to you? Understand? So that's why historically the history books look a little different until the archaeological digs and they found the cuneiform tablets and they began to understand some of these things. All right? Very good. That all was free. There was no charge for that. That was just all free. But King Belshazzar, so now let's begin with chapter 5, verse 2, and have Sam read for us if she will. Let's go all the way to verse 9 and then we'll stop and make a few comments. Okay, Sam?
While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king, his nobles, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. So they brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem. And the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. As they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Suddenly, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall, near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his legs became weak and his knees were knocking. The king summoned the enchanters, astrologers, diviners. Then he said to these wise men of Babylon, "Whoever reads this writing and tells me what it means will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around his neck, and he will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom." Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or tell the king what it meant. So King Belshazzar became even more terrified, and his face grew more pale. His nobles were baffled.
Okay, let's stop there. So let's go back and pick it up again. Remember that this king is holding a banquet for 1,000 of his nobles to celebrate together. The historians think this may have been his last party. He's doing this as he knows he's soon going to get defeated by the Assyrians, by the Persians and the Medes. In fact, chapter 5 ends with the Persians and the Medes coming in and taking over Babylon. And so they think it's like his last big shindig. And he's having 1,000 of his nobles together to drink wine. They get quite drunk while they're there. And during the time, he makes a horrendous mistake when it comes to Yahweh, to God. While he was drinking, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem. When Nebuchadnezzar took these goblets that the Israelites used in they used in Jerusalem, in the temple, why were they in the temple, these goblets in the temple? Is it because that's where the storage was? No. Why were they there? They were used what?
They were holy.
They were holy. They were used for
God.
part of the worship of the Lord in the temple, and that's what these goblets were for. And there were so many because, remember, there was like 3 million Israelites, and there were a lot of priests that had to be there, and these were shared by the priests and used by the priests and things of that nature. Nebuchadnezzar took them as artifacts and trophies of his conquest of Jerusalem, but he was wise enough not to use them because he didn't want to rile the anger of their God, you see? So, but this guy, he's drunk, and he says, let's, eat, drink, and be merry, because tomorrow we die. That was the idea. He knew that the end was coming. Tomorrow we die. So he brings these things in, and they brought in the gold goblets and had taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem, and the kings and the nobles, his wives and his concubines, drank from them. As they drank the wine, they did what in verse 4? Praised the gods of what? Gold and silver and bronze and iron and wood and stone. Idols. They're using these gold and silver goblets, and they're praising the gods of gold and silver and all these other idols. And so it was just outright debauchery in the eyes of God. So suddenly, the fingers of a human hand appear and wrote on the plaster on the wall near the lampstand. And that was important because you got to realize they could see it. It was in a place where it could be seen by all in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. Now that had to be a frightening sight. I'm sure that was the last drink he took for a while because that had to be terrible. The king watched the hand as he wrote, and his face turned pale. He was so frightened that his legs became weak and his knees were knocking. This is, the idea, knocking knees. His knees were knocking, he was so afraid. So he summons his enchanters and astrologers and diviners, and he says to them, read this for me and tell me what it means. And none of them were able to read it and decipher it. So he's now even more terrified because not knowing what it means. Now, Sandy, yes, bet you pick up verse 10.
Okay. Where do you want me to stop?
I'll stop you.
Okay. The queen, hearing the voices of the king and his nobles, came into the banquet hall. "May the king live forever," she said. "Don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale. There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your father, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. Your father, King Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. He did this because Daniel, whom the king called Belteshazzar, was found to have a keen mind and knowledge and understanding, and also the ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve difficult problems. Call for Daniel, and he will tell you what the writings mean."
Okay, let's stop there. Second. So the queen comes in. The queen and her concubines and all her people were not usually allowed to party with the king and his people. They always kept separate. They might be rooms adjoining, but they were kept separate. She comes in and she tells the king, "Don't be upset, don't be alarmed, don't be so pale. There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods." That's how they called Daniel, the spirit of the holy gods, plural, because of their polytheism, in him. In the time of your father, he was found to have insight and intelligence. Now, when they say your father, again, in the records of how things go in line, if it's your father, your grandfather, or even your great-grandfather, he's still called your father. Now, the records know exactly who it means, but he's given the title for your father. He was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. So your father, King Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him chief of the magicians. Now, see, here's the thing that's so strange. Well, it's not strange. You see the anger of them. The king in verse 7 summoned these guys, enchanters, magicians, and diviners, right? When they couldn't read it, what would you think they would have said?
Call Daniel.
Our boss can read this for you. He can do this, but they don't want him to read it. Why?
Makes them look bad.
Makes them look bad, and not only makes them look bad, but what? Puts him third in charge
Oh, yeah.
of the whole land. And people used to think that the reason he said third in charge was because, well, it would be the king and then the queen and then the next person. No, it was him and his father who was in exile. And that's why he would be third in charge. But he would be put in that high position, be wearing a royal robe and be honored and all that. And they didn't like this little Jewish boy getting all these honors. They didn't like him from the beginning, even though he saved their lives by being able to interpret for Nebuchadnezzar, tell him what the dream was, and then interpret it. And by doing that, he saved all their lives. Remember that in chapter 2. And so they never acknowledge him as who he really is. They always were trying to get rid of him. In the next chapter, we see it even further with the lion's den story. But they don't bring his name up. So the queen comes in and she says, there's a man who has the spirit of the holy gods in him, that during your father's time he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. So they call for Daniel, and he will tell you what this writing means. Okay, Sandy, pick up 13 through 16.
Okay. So Daniel was brought before the king, and the king said to him, "Are you Daniel, one of the exiles my father, the king, brought from Judah? I have heard that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that you have insight, intelligence, and outstanding wisdom. The wise men and enchanters were brought before me to read this writing and tell me what it means, but they could not explain it. Now I have heard that you are able to give interpretations and to solve difficult problems. If you can read this and tell me what it means, you will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around your neck, and you will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom."
Okay, so Belshazzar realizes that if he's going to know what's going on here, he's going to have to find this guy Daniel. It's a mystery as to why Daniel is such a mystery. You know, but it shows you again, they really were prejudiced, and they did not want these foreigners to be in charge. And they did all they could to keep them away from having an influence. They meaning the other magicians and stuff, as well as even the kings themselves, except Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar liked the guy. Nebuchadnezzar went to him all the time easily. So he says he can read this, and this is what it means. Now, Dave, you follow along still?
Yes.
Okay, how about you pick it up with 17 and stop after 17?
17.
Yeah.
Then Daniel answered the king, "You may keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means."
Okay, the reason I want to just read that part is it shows you where Daniel's at, and he's not going to buy any of this. He doesn't want to be third in charge of the place. He's not doing this for wealth or for prestige. And you would think that the other enchanters and astrologers would appreciate that, but they don't. But he tells them, basically says, you can keep your gifts. I don't want them, which is a real insult to the one giving the gifts. Okay, Dave, pick up 18 and go to 21.
"Your Majesty, the Most High God, gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. Because of the high position he gave him, all the nations and peoples of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted. And those he wanted to humble, he humbled. But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. He was driven away from people and given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like the ox, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven, until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth, and sets over them anyone he wishes."
Okay, that last line is the whole point, is that while they're in captivity, remember, God didn't protect them from being held captive. He didn't stop the Assyrians from taking the northern kingdom, and he didn't stop Nebuchadnezzar from taking the southern kingdom into captivity. He let them do that. But when he lets them do that, and he wants them to understand, but God is still sovereign over you. That's why you did it. And that's why you could do it. And he's still sovereign now. And you need to bow your knee to this God. You can't be like Nebuchadnezzar, who took great pride, thinking this was all in his own strength, his own ability and everything. Look, Babylon, the great city, what I have built. And then he ends up on his knees in the woods. So he takes time to witness to the folks of the majesty of the God Most High, that Nebuchadnezzar learned of his greatness and glory and splendor because of the high position God gave him. All the nations and peoples in every language dreaded and feared him. But it was because God gave him those things. And he had that authority, he had that power because it was from the Lord. But in his pride, he took the credit to himself, and that was the sinful pride we talked about last week. He takes the credit to himself, and God humbled him until he learned his lesson. And they all knew that story. They all knew what had happened to Nebuchadnezzar. That wasn't like a secret. They all knew that. They didn't include it in the annals of history because they didn't want to include it in the annals of the history. All right. Who from the Rescue Mission read last week? Yeah. Would you like to read again?
Yep, where we at?
Verse 22.
22?
Yeah.
Sure.
And you can take it down to verse 25 with a many, many tekel parson.
Okay,
Right,
I read
okay.
King James Version. 22, right?
Well, it'll be hard for us to follow.
You said
I
verse
think.
21, right?
22.
22?
Well, you try and see how we do.
All right. And thou, his son, O Belshazzar, has not humbled thine heart, though thou knowest all this, but hast lifted up thyself against the Lord of heaven. And they have brought the vessels of his house before thee, and thy lords, thy wives, and thy concubines have drank wine in them. And thou hast praised the gods of silver and gold, and of brass, iron, wood, and stone, which see not, nor hear, nor know, and the God in whose hands thy breath is, and whose are all thy ways, hast thou not glorified. Then was the part of the hand sent from him, and this writing was written. And this is the writing that was written. Many, many tekel of heresy.
Parson, right. Okay, stop there. Thank you very much. Many, many tekel parson. This is Persian. And it wasn't the fact that none of the astrologers knew other languages. They knew the languages, but they didn't know what it meant, because these are just 4 nouns that were put out there on the wall. It's not a sentence. It's not put together to make sense. It's just 4 words put on a wall. And Daniel's able to take the 4 words and interpret them because they were written as adverbs now instead of nouns. And he's able to translate what happens because of what they represent early. And here's what these words mean. He says, many, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. If you have a note in your Bible, like the NIV does here, you can see many can mean numbered, or mina, a unit of money. So Daniel's the one who takes that and interprets that it means God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Imagine if you're the king and you hear that. Tekel, so when he says many, many, and then tekel, by saying it twice, what has he just done?
Put emphasis.
He's established the certainty of the matter by saying it twice. It's definitely going to happen. And then tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. And tekel means weighed, or can mean shekel. It can mean a unit of money. You've been found on the scales and found wanting. You've been weighed and you've been found wanting. So God has judged you, and you have not done well. And then parson, the singular being Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. And that was the message that he received. So the message he received from the hand of God. And when did this message get written? what did he do that made the message come? Remember what he
They were
did?
drinking from the glasses.
He
that
called
belonged
for
to
the,
God.
the goblets from God's temple to come and use those goblets, and we're going to use those, and with them, we're going to now do what?
Praise God.
We're going to
Praise
praise the
God.
gods of gold and silver and bronze and wood and stone. And in other words, we're going to use things committed, dedicated just to Yahweh, and we're going to use them in idolatry, for the purpose of idolatry. And God said, okay, that's enough. Here's what's going to happen. And he puts his hand down there and writes these things. Now, was this the hand of God in the fact that does God have a hand? No, God is a spirit. He doesn't have a hand. But they're called, this fancy term, anthropomorphic examples of where something that, like God without a body, is expressed in terms of a body. Anthropomorphism. I get it right eventually. This old head of mine now. And so he sees a hand, like we could do that today very easily with holograms or something. He sees a hand, and he sees it writing on that wall, these words, these 4 words, the first 2 being the same. And he shakes with fear and when he hears the message, now look what happens. Then at Belshazzar's command, Daniel was clothed in purple. So he said, all the things I would give you, I'm going to give you. Why does he do that, do you think? Why does he go ahead and give him these things anyway? What may he be hoping?
Change his.
That he'll change the message. See, we're going to give you these things anyway. Here, we're going to give you all this good stuff. And then at Belshazzar's commands, Daniel was clothed in purple. A gold chain was placed around his neck, and he was proclaimed the 3rd highest ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. This is 539 BC. So the Babylonian Empire has now become defunct. It no longer exists. It ended. That's a pretty significant historical thing. And it's interesting that within a few years, from the power of Nebuchadnezzar, it goes to nothing within a few years, short years. And how powerful was it when it came into Jerusalem and took the city and took the captives? It was the most powerful army at the known world at the time. There was nobody more powerful than Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon. And yet God turned it around in just 70 years. He turned it around. And in the end of Nebuchadnezzar's life, shortly afterward, the whole empire ends, because God raises empires up and God takes them down as he pleases. And now the reign of the Medes and the Persians. The Medes and the Persians become the most powerful armies on the world at the time now. They take over Assyria and Babylon, and they rule the known world at the time. It's quite a long span of property. We'd be today modern Iraq, Iran, and Saudi Arabia, and Palestine, and all the way down to Egypt. So quite a reign. Any questions?
Pastor, did Daniel keep the stuff that they gave him, the robes and the?
You always ask me questions the Bible never answers, you know that? That's why you have the question, isn't it, Darlene? Because it doesn't say. Well, it's not said. I doubt if he kept them, because why would he want them? It doesn't mean anything.
Yeah. I was just wondering if he gave them back, what was the reaction
Yeah.
when he gave it back?
You know, when you get to heaven, you got a lot of things to ask God, don't you? Yeah, fill in the blanks for me, will you?
Yeah.
Yeah, and they're good thoughts, wondering what happened, but I don't think he'd want any of that stuff, because it doesn't mean anything. when the next king comes in, what the previous king had is nothing. It doesn't mean anything.
I got another question. Why was?
All right, am I gonna be able to answer this one or
No,
not?
I don't think so.
Okay, well, that's good anyway. That's good.
Why was the king slain? You said the king that gave him the,
Why was he slain?
yeah.
God took his life for what? The idolatry,
Okay.
for taking the very articles that were
Okay.
committed to God, that were dedicated to the Lord, and using them in idol worship.
No, I thought maybe it might have had something to do with him giving Daniel the.
Yeah, it doesn't do that. No, it was because of his idolatry.
Okay.
Yep.
So you could answer.
I could answer that one, and with confidence. Yes, Sherry.
Go back to the handwriting on the wall. Is that where the phrase, "Can't you read the writing on the wall"?
Yes, that's exactly where it comes from. There are two things that come out of this chapter that are colloquialisms or just, what do you call them? Well, one is the handwriting's on the wall. That's one. And the other is when you're so scared, what happens? Your knees knock. The knocking of the knees. That's another one that comes out of this passage. I was teasing with Nick, who, how many employers before was it two before? Two before, where some things were happening at the company and with the stocks being, I don't know, it was very obvious that they were gonna sell the company. And he's telling me about this, and I said to him, many tekel parson. The handwriting is on the wall. So, and it was it like the next week or something, the company got sold. But he kept his job, which was great. We're done a few minutes early today. Other questions? The next chapter is a short one, but it's one of my favorite. It's it's Daniel in the lion's den, and I've not always, but often have said now, you never get to sleep with the lions until you first commit to resolve that you're not going to eat the king's food. And by having that step of faith and making that, trusting the Lord that much, that I'll trust you with my life to follow you, by making that commitment that I will not eat the king's food. And if it works, great. If it doesn't, take our lives. The next one was the fiery furnace. If it works, great, but know this, Nebuchadnezzar, whether God rescues us or not, we're still not going to bow down to your image. Is that you never get to do these next steps of greater things until you take the first step of faith that God brings you to. Kathy?
Just giving the bad news to the king could have killed him.
Yeah. Yep.
So it's a series of should have been killed, could have been killed, could have been killed, could have been killed.
But you see Daniel trusting the Lord all the way through this, and his faith is so strong, and the reason he's so strong is he has no fear. If you fear what people can do to you, it ruins your faith. But, we know that our soul's going to go to be with the Lord. And so, yeah, you don't like to get bad news, or you don't like troublesome situations, or you don't like scary things with being in a mall and somebody shooting people. You don't like this, but we don't have to fear like others fear. We understand that no one can take our soul from us. And if they kill us now, that we're going to be with the Lord. It's by far better. And that faith is what enabled Daniel and his three friends to go as far as they went. Daniel is honored in 4 administrations: Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, Cyrus, and Darius. Or Darius and Cyrus, I might get those backwards. But he goes through 4 administrations, and he gets the blessing of the last to allow the Israelites to go back, to leave the country, and to go back and to take with them gold and money and stuff to build the wall. to rebuild. I mean, it's just remarkable. But you never get to have these great moments of faith. And you don't get to see these kinds of things happen until you first resolve to follow the first step that God gives you to take. And there have been various artist renderings of Daniel in the lion's den. Some having walking around and the lions kind of walking around, nothing to do with him, ignoring him like he's not even there. But my favorite is by an artist that has Daniel laying up against the lion. The lions are all gathered together and they're laying down, and Daniel is laying up against them with one arm on one and one hand on another, and just petting them while he slept that night in the lion's mane. That's what I picture it as, because he didn't have to fear. God was taking care of him, and that's the thing to learn with faith. You don't let fear ruin your faith. You've got nothing to fear. Okay, we'll have some coffee and whatnot.
Should have wore your hat today.
I should have worn my hat today. No fear, got faith. I'll wear it tomorrow. I'll wear it next week for Lions Den.